Welcome to the Books and Travel podcast. I'm Jo Frances Penn, thriller and dark fantasy author, bringing you escape and inspiration about unusual and fascinating places, as well as the deeper side of books and travel. You can find the episode show notes at booksandtravel.page, and if you enjoy thrillers set in international locations, download one of my ebooks for free at jfpen.com/free. Hello travellers, I'm Jo Frances Penn, and today I have an interview with international mystery and crime author J.J. Marsh about the island of Mallorca, which we both love and have also both used in our novels. If you don't know Mallorca, it's the largest island of the Balearics, part of Spain and in the western Mediterranean. Its strategic position on the way to North Africa meant that it has thousands of years of inhabitation, from the Neolithic period and on to the Phoenicians, the Romans, the Moors and the Catholics. If you visit the island, you'll fly into the city of Palma, which many see as a gateway to the beach resorts. But as Jill and I discussed, there is much more to see in the old walled city, as well as in Deia and the rest of the island. We share some of the places we enjoy, as well as the food and the wine you might like to try. So I love Mallorca, and as I record this on a cold, wet day in the last days of September 2020, during pandemic times, I would love to be on the island once more. The last time we went a few years back, my husband booked a yoga retreat in the interior of the island, and I insisted on a few days in Palma beforehand, as I'm far more of an architecture, history and culture fan than I am of hours of yoga every day. Now don't get me wrong, I enjoy occasional yoga, but I'd rather be eating good food and drinking wine overlooking the ocean in the sun. So we had a few days in Palma, and one morning we walked around the corner from the hotel to find a statue outside the Franciscan Basilica. It was Junipero Serra, the friar I had read about when visiting the Mission District in San Francisco. I had known he was Spanish, but not that he was born in Mallorca and studied there before heading off to Mexico and then up the coast of what later became California, founding the missions along the way. And that moment of synchronicity tied the island of Mallorca to California and also the Inquisition, which took me to New Orleans. And I've done a few interviews about that, as you can find in the history of the podcast. And that became the story that turned into my arcane thriller, Valley of Dry Bones. So both Jill and I talk about our love of travelling for book research and being able to find a story in any of the places we visit. So I hope you enjoy escaping to the island of Mallorca with us today. J.J. Marsh is the best-selling author of the Beatrice Stubbs crime series. Her latest book is The Woman in the Frame, set in Mallorca, which we're talking about today. Welcome to the show, Jill.
Thanks for having me, Jo.
Oh, it's great to talk to you. And I should say we're recording this still not in lockdown, but we can't travel much. So I said to you, I wish we could be on the island of Mallorca having a glass of wine to do this.
I've got the exact right wine in mind as well.
Oh, have you? Oh, we're going to come back to that. Let's start, in case people don't know. So why Mallorca? Tell us where it is and why you were so attracted to it you wanted to write a book.
Mallorca is a Spanish island. It's the largest of the Balearics, but unfortunately it's more associated with drunken tourism than culture. But if you travel away from Palma in the south towards the north, you discover a landscape and a history, and it's just such a wonderful place. You would want to keep it a secret. As for my attraction to it, that's personal. As the child of an engineer, I grew up in Nigeria and Dubai and Hong Kong. So while my teenage self was pretty well travelled, I wasn't so familiar with Europe. Then I found out that my estranged paternal grandfather lived in Mallorca, and one of my uncles engineered a family reconciliation. And when we first met him in the north of Mallorca, I was just completely enthralled, both by him and his Hemingway-esque persona, and the island itself. As a story location, I think Mallorca's been waiting in the back of my mind for over 30 years.
Wow, that is so interesting that you're
Thank you.
obviously growing up around the world. That is just fascinating. I just want to come back on the drunken tourism reputation. You're right, Magaluf is
Oh,
famous to British people as young partiers. But I stayed in Palma, and I actually set some of one of my books there, Valley of Dry Bones, because of the monastery and the Franciscans there.
oh
And so
yes.
yeah, so Palma has this wonderful kind of old city of almost Templar sort of style architecture. But you're right, if you go outside of that in that area. But do you like that old city area as well?
Yeah, I do. I'm a big fan of these kind of old historical cities. We were recently in Naples and also in Bordeaux, and those kinds of places with their history and the kind of, especially places like Naples, which has been taken over by so many different cultures and influenced by so many external forces. Yes, I love it. And I think Parma's the same, obviously, because of where it is.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are some of the places on the island that you particularly enjoy, or that you featured in the book, or any more unusual ones?
The book is centred around the town of Deia in the north, but also Port de Soler and Soler. They're both absolutely blissful, gorgeously picturesque, with outdoor markets and higgledy-piggledy little houses up and down the mountain. Also, Deia in particular is shadowed by the mountains, the Tramuntura, and it puts it in it's like a little amphitheatre, basically. There are also all these little coves and rocky points where you can just stand and gaze at the ocean. As for unusual things that made it into the book, I think probably it's less to do with locations and more to do with the details that I was 17 when I first went there. And it's little details like that found their way in. And I had to check, of course, that they're still happening. Things like a chocolate milk drink called La Cow and black pearl earrings my father bought for me in the market. And the sardines, the smell of grilled sardines and the sound of the cicadas, all of that stuff really brings Mallorca to life for me. Oh, there was also another thing called, which my grandfather, I was 17 and not allowed to drink, but that didn't bother him. It was it's a drink that's sort of got an aniseed flavour called yerbas. And I got a real taste for that at the age of 17 years old. The other thing this is the great thing about being an author, of course, you find a beautiful location and you can take it from wherever you want and put it wherever you want. So there's a cafe that appears in the book, which is actually stolen from Porto. Cafe Majestic is an Art Nouveau bar and restaurant, which I've actually just relocated to Soler. And the original Cafe Majestic, which is on Rua de Santa Catarina in Porto, is legendary for having the most beautiful architecture and the rudest waiters in the world.
That's funny. And in the book, you do talk about a poet, I think, who's associated, another author who's associated with the island.
Robert Graves, yes, one of the wartime poets. It was interesting while I was researching all about Robert Graves, who I've always been interested in anyway, and I was also researching the other poets like Siegfried Sassoon and people like that. I found out that Siegfried Sassoon had a lover whose name was Thomas Pruitt, which is actually my real name. My writer's J.J. Marsh, but my real name is Jill Pruitt. So yeah, there were all sorts of connections that when you start digging, you find out the most wonderful things. You would know, wouldn't you, as an archaeologist type of author?
As that kind of brain, yes. But
Yeah.
So where were the places particularly associated with Graves?
Deia, that's where he lived.
Okay.
His house is still there, and it's a museum that you can visit. And his great nephew, a guy called Simon Goff, wrote a book called The White Goddess, An Encounter, based on his experiences visiting his great uncle. And it brings the place completely to life. I really would highly recommend that.
And you mentioned there the sort of the ocean and also the mountains. I feel in my head the life of Mallorca is mainly around the coastline. Have you visited the interior? What is the rest of it?
I think it's really interesting, the interior. It's like a lot of islands. It depends what the action is, where you make your money. And so obviously if it were agriculture or mining, there are huge pearl factories, surprisingly, on the island of Mallorca. So yes, definitely going inland is wonderful. But of course, it depends. George Sand spent some time in the north of Mallorca when she was living with Frédéric Chopin. They went to spend the winter there, thinking that the kind of heat and the sunshine would be good for his TB. But the north of the island is quite misty and foggy and not very healthy for somebody with tuberculosis in those days. I guess it depends where you go. But yeah, I would recommend going interior.
And they have those fincas, don't they? These sort of large houses with a courtyard, almost like the Romans, because it gets so hot in the daytime. You have a sort of sheltered courtyard. You know what I mean?
Yeah, sorry. Yes, I misheard you when I thought you said thinkers, and I was thinking philosophers. But I'm with you now. I'm with you, yes. Thinkers, yep, definitely. It's the same sort of thing. They do this a lot in Spain and Portugal as well, where you have these kind of old, they call them posadas in Spain and Portugal, those old converted places, as you say, with large courtyards, and they're now transformed into hotels, really nice hotels as well.
Yes, with sort of shade in the hot summer day. Yes, so wonderful. I also when I was in Palma, and I see the history behind things, and you talk about Robert Graves there, the war poet, and there's always death underlies these things, but I feel like many people just see Mallorca as a sort of holiday island, and it's love. I think it's actually used for that, Love Island, isn't it? The TV show Love Island. I wonder about you, how do you see through beauty and this sort of tourists thing to the darker side of places? Because you write murder in paradise basically in this book.
Murder in paradise, that's a great phrase. Yeah, I don't know. I think that having lived abroad the majority of my life away from Britain, I would say that one person's paradise is another's prison. I spent a lot of time in the company of people who would describe themselves as expats, and I noticed there's a huge level of unhappiness, even to the extent of alcoholism, and a yearning to be away from those beautiful places, those glorious beaches, those jaw-dropping landscapes, whatever it might be. So there's a kind of self-deception where people want their friends and their family to envy them for the heat and the exoticism of, I don't know, their Moroccan villa with an infinity pool, while secretly they ache to be home with a view of Bolton Gasworks. So it's this kind of dichotomy that interests me, where people start to live double lives. There's the kind of outward-facing social media kind of fiction, and then there's the reality of what they're up to. So my books are about people, their motivations, their secrets, and the problems that result from those two things, because that's where I think it gets interesting.
That's so interesting you say that, actually, because I lived in Brisbane in Australia, Queensland, Australia, got the white sand beaches, blah, blah, blah. And I used to, in order to write, that's where I started writing, I would put headphones on and listen to pouring rain. And I feel like there's something British about, it's sunny, I must go outside. And of course, you can't do that in Queensland. It's just too hot and you'll never get anything done. And so it's exactly what you say. This is meant to be paradise, but this is not my paradise.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that we have that kind of concept of work has to be dull and dreary and so on. And yet when it's a beautiful place, we feel almost guilty for not being out and enjoying it. Yeah, I completely get that. That makes a lot of sense to me.
So as someone who obviously you travelled so much, what is home to you when you've been to so many places?
Home right now is here. In fact, actually, this is going to sound implausible, but a bit like you, I've always been fascinated by maps. And as you just said, my childhood was pretty nomadic. But I do recall when we were home in Wales one time, I went into the kitchen with one of my favourite books, which was the Times Atlas of the World. And I said, Mum, I've decided where I want to live when I grow up. And I poked my little finger at the map of Europe and I said, either there or there. And she looked at the two cities and she said, that's very nice, darling, but you're learning French at school. In Turin, they speak Italian, and in Zurich, they speak German. Are you sure? I said, yes, I want to be in the middle of things. And she's reminded me of that conversation every time she visited Zurich after I moved here in 2004. So home very much is here now. I'm married a Swiss guy. We've got a house and a life here. And I'm also very grateful for my Welsh heritage as well. That's given me a kind of cultural insight, I think, which is rather special on the kind of Celtic bow. But home to me is Europe. I've got Swiss citizenship now. I applied for that immediately after the Brexit referendum. Being that little bit, it really never leaves you. I've even taught my Swiss husband to say "achavi," which he does rather well.
And what does that mean for people listening?
It's achavi means it's don't be so disgusting. If a child picks something off the floor, you say, "Oh no, don't eat that, achavi." It's a very strong one, and it's also got that kind of guttural sound, and it really sounds, "Put it down, that's disgusting."
That seems like an odd thing to teach him.
That's useful when you've got 3 dogs.
No, fair enough. Coming back to Mallorca, your main character, Beatrice Stubbs, enjoys good food and wine. And you mentioned there about what wine we might be drinking right now. So what are some of your recommendations for food and wine when visiting Mallorca?
A wine I had in mind that one of these days we will enjoy a glass is a red called Can Catora, which my husband bought that for me because I've been trying to doing rapid release, which I've never done before. And I tried to write 3 books in 6 months and publish 3 in 3 months. And my kind of motivation, which I had sitting here on my desk all the way through trying to write The Woman in the Frame, was a bottle of Can Catora that when I actually finished it, I was allowed to drink. But the funny thing is about Mallorca, you'd think it would all be fish and wine, obviously being a Mediterranean island. But Mallorca's got this really interesting tradition of craft breweries. They make IPA, wheat beer and amber ale, and all of it's organic and artisanal. So it's a million miles away from Carling Black Label and Magaluf. As for food, though, I'm a non-meat eater, so I love the seafood, the tapas, and the quintessential tumbet, which is a vegetable dish with eggs. It's a bit like ratatouille or shakshuka. But yeah, if that's the kind of, if you really wanted to explore Mallorca in a culinary sense, that it's really got to be the fine wine and the fresh fish.
Absolutely. And I feel like there are options at all level of budgets as well, because as I said, I think there is this sort of upper class town in Palma where you can go to some really incredible restaurants, but then you can also get the sort of more street food or tapas on the beach type of thing.
Absolutely, yeah. And the funny thing about Deia now is it used to be a kind of artist's enclave, which is the Robert Graves era. But now it's become a huge celebrity playground in terms of posh hotels. Richard Branson's got a big hotel there. Lots of celebrities go there to just unwind and relax. And yeah, so you've got all levels. You can literally have something on the street and you can go to a 5-star restaurant with really excellent cuisine, all in the same town.
Isn't there a monastery in the north as well?
I don't recall, but you're probably right. There must have been. Monks get everywhere.
Yeah, they do. But it's funny because I also think we went on a yoga retreat to Mallorca. It's got that sort of level of yoga and spiritual and retreat, as well as the sort of eating and drinking and partying.
It really has. And I think that's why Deia has become so well known for this kind of thing. It's just a really strange thing. As soon as there's a sense of kind of well-being. And it could be to do with the sun and the beautiful sparkling Mediterranean Sea and all the rest of it. But there's something about the sandstone and the kind of benevolent mountains above and the sea below. It really has got something special. And I can't quite put my finger on it, but everyone says the same thing. It just makes you feel good.
I must say, I really want to go back once we're out of the way we are in the world right now. But it's also interesting, like my husband and I love Spain. We given a choice, we would do Spain. In fact, I almost moved to Spain back in the 90s. But
where were you going to go?
I don't really know where. I think I fell in love with Granada and like down there in Andalusia. But what I found is that I'm a morning person and the Spanish are not. It's not really a morning culture. It's very much you go out late. Everything's much later. I'd be going to bed by 9:30 p.m. and that's when people actually just start going out in the evening.
True, yes.
But I wondered given that you live in Switzerland, the stereotype of the Swiss is that things are very organised, pretty regulated, and Spain to me is completely the opposite. So what do you find truth in those stereotypes, and how do you adjust being in Spain?
Yeah, I do find those stereotypes to be true. In fact, before I moved to Switzerland from London, but previous to that, the place I'd spent most of my time was in Portugal. And that was a kind of glorious chaos and rules were just to be laughed at, basically. Whereas Switzerland, it took me a while to adjust to the fact that if you're living in an apartment building, you don't have a shower after 10 o'clock at night because that disturbs other people and you have set washing days because the washing machines are all in the basement. And there are a lot of regulations. And at first I kicked against the traces, but gradually I began to realize that that's why the country works so well, and that's why it's so clean, and that's why it's so respectful and polite and efficient. So yes, it did take some adjustments, especially if you've moved from one place to another. And I think my previous experiences were all much more southern. So Switzerland's a strange combination of Germanic and Italian French culture. But over time, I've really grown to understand how it ticks. Haha, ticks. See what I did there?
Absolutely. So your books are all set in different places. So what's your research process when it comes to travel? Do you decide I want to write a book there and go there, or do they emerge from places that you travel to anyway?
A bit of both, I think. That's quite a tough question. You write in an incredible range of locations, but I've limited myself to one continent. And I always want to highlight something about Europe. Now, that could be something cultural, it could be something physical or whatever. So it depends. Sometimes the plot dictates the setting. So my first book was about a serial killer of unscrupulous businessmen, and that needed to be set in a financial centre. I happen to live in Zurich, so that was a no-brainer. But other times, wanted to set a story in Rioja country. A good friend of mine lives in Vitoria-Gasteiz. So I've started looking into what possible crimes could be written about wine, and found out that there were a huge amount. And firstly, that was the place and then the plot. So, and before this whole kind of shutdown business, I had an absolute blast traveling to European cities like Naples and Bordeaux for research trips with a gang of mates. And our next one was about to be Bruges, which is where I want to set my next book in Brussels. Whether it's not Bruges or not, I'm not sure. But now things have changed and I'm just less keen to take flights. And so my focus for the next book is where I can travel to by train. You can do so much online, but going there and just noticing the little tiny details make a big difference. So I'm currently trying to bully my husband into taking the sleeper train to Salzburg for the next book, but he's not given in yet.
It's so interesting. I did read the other day that because of the different time we're in and the fact that people are allowed to fly, but a lot of people don't even want to fly, that a lot of the night trains are coming back, like they're opening more train lines across Europe. So I feel like the heyday of trains disappeared with the sort of EasyJet, easy flight type mentality. But perhaps now train travel is going to also have a bit of a renaissance.
I really hope so. I think we probably read the same article because I was thrilled to read about that as well. But they did put a caveat towards the end of the article about how less profitable night trains are. It's night trains I'm particularly interested in, so that you get on, go to sleep in your own little compartment. You don't have to go through all of the security detail and all the rest of it that you might do in an airport. And then you wake up in another city, which for me, that sounds absolute bliss. But in terms of the number of people they can fit on these sleeper trains and the number of stops that they make, because usually you get people getting on and off, so you've got far more people, that it's not as profitable. But I'm really hoping that you're right. I'm crossing my fingers that a kind of golden age of train travel will come back.
Yeah, and I just wanted to come back on that vineyard as well. I actually interviewed Caro Feely on the podcast, who has a vineyard, and we talked then about all the things that can kill you in a vineyard. And it's surprising, like how many ways to die.
Really, in a vineyard?
Yeah, it's just like seriously. But I wondered, so when you travel then, so say you go to Salzburg, so how do you plan your research trips? Do you know you're going to go to specific places? How do you document it? I always find that interesting with people. Do you write a journal? Do you take pictures?
Yeah, I do. I take a lot of notes, I take a lot of pictures, and I keep everything, all the little maps, even the kind of ticket stubs and everything like that. I put that in I've got hundreds of these little books sitting here on my desk with stuff stuffed in them from all over the place. But one of the nice things, I said that I usually go with a gang of friends to these places. And that actually really helps because, for example, in Naples, I had city fatigue after a couple of days, and we went out for an island trip where the others went to visit Pompeii. And so I didn't actually go to see Pompeii, but one of my characters takes that train trip. So I asked them what details they could give me. And the funniest little details come out, where one person says I just remember all of these lemon trees in people's back gardens. And somebody else said, actually, the train station stank of wee. And there was just these little things that come up that you just, because I couldn't do it, they went there. But it's this personal kind of subjective viewpoint, which makes a big difference. But yeah, I take loads and loads of photos. I usually know where I want to go and where I'm going to set key things. I don't know if you know about it, but I did the Dan Brown masterclass, and he says you always have that kind of theatrical set that where some major action happens. So, for example, it could be the Louvre or it could be whatever. And in my case, it's in this new book, it's the castle on the top of Salzburg, which looks across the whole city. But I need to know if you can throw someone off a tower up there. So the only way of doing that was by...
So you're taking your husband?
He's already nervous. Where do you think he doesn't want to go?
No, I think that's fascinating. And you said you've got all these books on your desk with all these little research things in. How do you share those things with your readers?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I tend to hold the view that you need to be a sensory writer in order to take people there. You've got to make them feel the textures of the walls, the heat of the sand, the smell of the wine, whatever it might be. So it's very much a kind of sensory thing. But it's also the kind of juxtaposition of these things. I remember being in Rome and looking down at the Colosseum. No, yes, it was the Colosseum. And just thinking, this is extraordinarily beautiful. How can you actually conjure this up? And at the same time, there were two pigeons, either having a fight or having sex, I'm not sure what they were up to, in a tree behind me. And putting those two things together just brings that moment back. I interviewed a fascinating woman years ago who told me she traveled around India in the 1960s on her own, collecting moulage, which is a kind of wax representation of skin diseases. I know, really.
Oh my goodness.
I know. But she became the moulageuse of repute. She had a museum here in Zurich and so on. But she travelled around in the 1960s on her own, and to remember where she'd been and what she'd seen and so on, she wrote a haiku every day. And she said, I remember her saying to me, a haiku is very concentrated. It's like Nescafe, but it brings it all back for you in an instant. And I don't write poetry and I don't write haikus, but that kind of little notes like that about the pigeons and the Colosseum at the same time, it makes it stick in your mind somehow.
Although I hope no one would ever offer you Nescafe in Rome.
I wouldn't accept it.
No, exactly. Definitely not. Then I wanted to ask you, because we've talked a little bit about home, and in fact, you actually said home in Wales. So that was quite an interesting thing there. But given that you've lived so many places, I wonder about being an outsider. I obsess about this and about the idea of the other, because when we write about different places, we're generally writing as an outsider. And we're trying to distill the essence of a place. And I sometimes feel like there is this issue with stereotypes. And sometimes perhaps we write to underline something that we think we know. But I also think that maybe we see a certain truth as an outsider that people who live there can't see. So what do you feel about this outsider and writing books about cultures that aren't your own?
I think that's a very good point. I would agree completely with that. I'm going to be honest and say that from the books I've written about Beatrice Stubbs, which is all the different crime stories in different European places, she is an outsider. She's an older woman who comes from London. She ventures into all these new places with wide eyes and a bit wet behind the ears. So she sees it as a stranger, which gives me a certain amount of license. But at the same time, you're right to say sometimes a stranger can see things that an insider can't. And I think that one of the things I'm aware of, and I need to be careful here, is that I've been in Switzerland now since 2004, and gradually you start to change and you become a little bit Swisser. So I'm conscious of that as well, that my kind of British mentality has now been, I don't know how to describe it. It's like the Swissness has come around it like a Scotch egg. That's probably the best way I can describe it. But yes, so you're now looking through two different perspectives. You've got the British perspective and you've got the Swiss perspective, and you're a halfway house between the two. So that I remember returning to the UK a little while ago and saying something about, I can't even remember what it was. It was, I know, it was about chili peppers. And I said jalapeno peppers. And my friends all burst out laughing and said, they're called jalapeno peppers. What are you talking about? And it's that sort of thing that here you have to pronounce things properly. If it's a Spanish word, you pronounce it in Spanish. That's made me change a little bit. So yes, I agree with you completely. You're an outsider, but you're also an insider at the same time. I think also I would say that when I first came here, I was so desperately missing my writing crew back in Britain. And after a couple of months of moaning, I just decided, well, you can either whinge about it or you can set your own thing up. So that's what I did. I put out a feelers and for other writers. And now we've got a huge, vivid community here of all sorts of people running workshops and making e-signs and so on. So you become an outside insider in another way by finding your kind of group of people. And I'm not saying this is all bored housewives or anything like that. It's basically a huge international, multicultural group of people who are all, they're the one thing that brings us together is that we're all writers. So, yeah, you create your own kind of communities, I think.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I love that. And of course, I visited Zurich and spoke at one of your events. So
we did.
Yeah, I appreciated that. So this is books and travel. So apart from your own books, can you recommend a few books either about Mallorca or the Balearics or anything else?
I think probably I'd want to start with the one I mentioned just a little earlier, which would be The White Goddess, An Encounter by Simon Gough. As I said, he's the great nephew of Robert Graves, and his recollection of the island and the artistry of the town of Deia in particular is it's so vivid, it's almost cinematic. I enjoyed his book so much and his raconteur style that I contacted Gally Beggar, whose publishers, and I asked them if I could have an interview. I remember calling him at the appointed time and he didn't answer. So I left it for 10 minutes and I tried again. And he picked up the phone and apologised for missing the earlier call. And he said, "I'm so sorry, my dear. I was trussing a pheasant." And I just thought that was so precious. Okay, so there's that one, The White Goddess, An Encounter. The second one I would say is, and this is probably not so very complimentary about Mallorca itself, that would be A Winter in Mallorca, Un hiver en Mallorca, by George Sand. And of course, that was a 19th century scandal. She was a woman who took a man's name. She was living in sin with Frédéric Chopin and her two kids. She smoked cigars, she wore trousers, and she was scandalous for Paris. But Mallorca, she was absolutely jaw-dropping. But her perspective is deeply personal because obviously they went there for his health and that didn't work out so well. And the third one, there's no way I can talk about Spanish set books without mentioning The Shadow of the Wind, which was written by Carlos Ruiz Zafón, and he died earlier this year. It's not set on the islands, but it's set in Barcelona during Franco's dictatorship. And it's about a boy whose imagination is sparked by a story he discovers in a cemetery of forgotten books. It's an all-time favourite because it's got that kind of, not magical realism, it is realistic, but it's also imaginative and fantastical, and then also it comes crushing up against that horrible brutality of the Franco regime. I compared it previously to Night Train to Lisbon by Pascal Mercier, which is set in Portugal, and The Mysterious Flame of Queen Loana by Umberto Eco, set in Italy. They're both the same. They're all about a love affair with books and imagination, but set against the backdrop of brutal dictatorships. Now, I've just realised all three of those are historical fiction. I've just outed myself as an HF fan. Oh, God.
Oh, no, that's brilliant. So where can people find you and your books online?
My website is jjmarshauthor.com. I'm also very active on Facebook. I've got a Beatrice Stubbs page, a JJ Marsh page, and we do lots of chats and carryings on over there. And that's also JJ Marsh Author. I'm on Twitter, but mostly ranting about politics. And I'm also on Instagram, but again, mainly sharing pictures of cows. So it's not that fascinating.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for your time, Jill. That was great.
Absolute pleasure, Jo. Lovely to talk to you.
Thanks for joining me today on the Books and Travel podcast. I hope you found a moment of escape. You can find the episode show notes at booksandtravel.page. And if you enjoy thrillers set in international locations, download one of my books for free at jfpen.com/free. Happy travels until next time.